In the quiet, fog-draped town of Elmsworth, nestled between velvet hills and shadowed pine groves, lived a woman named Evelyn Whitmore, whose eyes once held the serenity of a river but now shimmered with buried storms. She was the kind of woman who moved through life with grace, her voice calm, her manners composed, and her heart, though broken, still beating with purpose. Years ago, Evelyn had been the beloved wife of Thomas Whitmore, a charismatic businessman whose empire reached into every corner of the town, from the banks to the boutiques. To the world, they were a picture of elegance and unity. But behind the iron gates of their estate, Evelyn was slowly being erased. Thomas, once a man of charm and laughter, grew into someone colder than the marble floors of their mansion. He controlled everything: her time, her words, even her thoughts. He dripped poison in the ears of their friends, painting Evelyn as fragile, forgetful, unstable. It began with whispers and ended with her being shut out of every room that once welcomed her. But it wasn't until the day she found a second phone hidden in the pocket of his overcoat, filled with messages to his assistant Celeste, pictures, plans, promises, that the final crack split her world wide open. Betrayal hit Evelyn not as a sharp stab but as a slow, suffocating burn. Her marriage, reputation, and identity had been carefully dismantled piece by piece, and all while she was smiling through charity dinners and hosting garden luncheons that no longer had her name on the invitations. When she confronted Thomas, he didn't deny it. Instead, he laughed, a low, dismissive chuckle that boiled her blood. "You have no proof. And even if you did, who would believe you? You're nothing without me," he had said, walking away with the confidence of a man who thought he owned the world and everything in it, including her. But what Thomas didn't know was that Evelyn, beneath her soft exterior, was made of something ancient and unbreakable. Raised by a father who'd been a chess grandmaster and a mother who survived war, Evelyn had grown up understanding strategy, patience, and the power of a perfectly executed endgame. For the next year, Evelyn disappeared from the public eye. Rumors swirled. Some said she had gone mad. Others whispered she'd moved abroad. Thomas, now publicly living with Celeste, turned their home into a social fortress, holding parties Evelyn used to plan, standing in the same rooms where he had first kissed her, now locking her out of her own history. What they didn't know was that Evelyn had taken her time to become invisible on purpose. She moved into a small, unassuming apartment in a neighboring town and began working under an alias with a group of forensic accountants and ethical hackers, old acquaintances of her father, who had always said, "Know your enemies better than they know themselves." She used her time wisely, uncovering offshore accounts, tracing shell companies, and discovering that Thomas's empire was not just rooted in lies but in illegal land grabs, falsified documents, and bribes. Evelyn compiled every document, every signature, every photo, and built a story so compelling that even the sharpest lawyer couldn't untangle it. But she wasn't ready to strike. No, not yet. She wanted more than justice. She wanted him to feel everything she had felt: the humiliation, the helplessness, the exile. She needed a fall not from legality but from grace. She began by creating a foundation in her maiden name, the Whitaker Trust, focused on helping women rebuild their lives after emotional and financial abuse. Quietly, it gained attention, donors, and media interest. Journalists started digging into Evelyn's story, but all they found was an elegant woman with a passion for justice and no desire to speak ill of her past. That mystique only drew more attention. And then, once everything was in place, Evelyn made her first move. She leaked the documents anonymously to a journalist with a sterling reputation for exposing corporate corruption. Within weeks, headlines splashed across every major outlet: Whitmore Industries under investigation, whistleblower reveals decade of fraud, hidden empire of greed. But Evelyn wasn't done. On the very night Thomas was to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award at a gala he had hosted for years, she returned to Elmsworth, walking into the venue in a floor-length emerald dress, her hair swept up like a crown, eyes glittering with calm power. The room fell silent. Thomas froze mid-speech, the color draining from his face. Cameras flashed. And then Evelyn stepped up to the podium, not as a scorned ex-wife, but as the keynote speaker invited by the charity committee she had quietly funded for months. As Evelyn stood at the podium, her presence was like a silent thunderclap, elegant, composed, and commanding. She didn't look at Thomas directly, though she could feel his eyes clawing at her in disbelief. Instead, she smiled graciously at the crowd and began to speak with warmth and clarity. "Tonight," she said, her voice floating through the hushed room, "we gather to celebrate the legacy of those who build not just empires, but communities. Those who choose truth over comfort, integrity over convenience." Her words were a blade wrapped in silk, slicing through the polished lies that Thomas had built his kingdom upon. Every sentence was deliberate, laced with personal allusions masked in metaphor, and the audience drank it in, sensing something deeper beneath her poised exterior. After her speech, she stepped down slowly, the hem of her dress gliding like mist across the marble floor. She did not stop to acknowledge Thomas, who stood at the edge of the stage, paralyzed, his smile forced, his hand limp beside the trophy he now seemed unworthy to hold. As she walked past, their eyes locked for the briefest moment. In that split second, Evelyn saw everything: his rage, confusion, and the dawning realization that he had lost control of a game he hadn't even realized he was playing. The next few weeks were a hurricane of fallout. The investigation Evelyn had sparked dug deeper than anyone anticipated. Whistleblowers came forward, emboldened by the anonymous leak. Former employees who had been paid off or threatened with lawsuits now found protection in numbers. Evelyn, always one step ahead, released timed packets of evidence, never enough to expose everything at once, but just enough to ensure the media cycle never forgot. Thomas's company stock plummeted, investors pulled out, and deals that had taken years to negotiate unraveled in days. Celeste, the once smirking assistant who had stood on Evelyn's ashes to build her own empire, was exposed as the director of several laundering operations under fake companies' names Evelyn had traced and reported with surgical precision. Arrests began. Board members resigned. Banks froze accounts. Evelyn didn't appear in interviews or take credit for any of it. She remained elusive, her public persona limited to her foundation's growing success. In private, however, she was the conductor of the most beautiful symphony of reckoning Elmsworth had ever witnessed. Thomas, stripped of his power and assets, began to spiral. Paparazzi hounded him. News anchors speculated daily about prison time. Former allies ignored his calls, and whispers of betrayal replaced his once respected name. The mansion, the very home Evelyn had designed, every painting and pillar a piece of her once happy life, was seized by the government for investigation and asset liquidation. She drove by one day alone, watching from the car as auctioneers labeled furniture and officials marched in and out with briefcases. The gates that once barred her entry now hung open, rusted at the hinges. Still, Evelyn didn't stop. She wasn't here to gloat. She was here to witness closure. When the final nail was driven into the coffin of Whitmore Industries, a televised announcement of its dissolution, Evelyn was sipping tea at a sunlit cafe, smiling politely at the barista and listening to a mother nearby tell her child a story. Peace, she realized, didn't come from vengeance itself, but from the power of reclaiming her own narrative. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done. Months later, just as the town began to forget the storm and rebuild in its wake, Thomas reemerged not as a businessman, but as a broken man seeking sympathy. He gave interviews claiming he had been manipulated, that Evelyn had orchestrated everything, even framing him. It was a desperate grasp, a final thrash in sinking water. He wept on camera, begged for forgiveness, even filed a lawsuit accusing Evelyn of defamation. But Evelyn had expected this too. She released a single statement through her lawyer, a calm, surgical refutation of every claim, each line backed by dates, signatures, and independent testimonies. The media, once briefly curious, now turned on Thomas with a vengeance. His credibility, already cracked, shattered completely. The lawsuit was thrown out. Fines piled up, and in a final blow, a former prosecutor turned author wrote a book detailing the entire scandal, painting Evelyn as a quiet warrior of justice, a woman who, after being shattered, built herself into a fortress. Bookstores placed it front and center. Talk shows quoted it. And Evelyn? She never once spoke publicly about it. Her silence became her armor, her grace, her ultimate revenge. One evening, Evelyn visited her parents' graves in the old cemetery outside Elmsworth. She knelt between their stones, fingers brushing the carved names, and whispered, "I did it, Mom. I didn't let them destroy me." The wind rustled the grass like an answer, soft and approving. She stayed there for a long while, not crying. She had shed all those tears long ago, but simply existing in a space of peace that had taken her years to earn. As the sun dipped below the hills and twilight settled over the town, Evelyn rose and walked back to her car. She wasn't returning to the past anymore. Her future, unbound and hers alone, stretched out like a road gleaming with endless possibilities. Months passed, and Evelyn settled into a rhythm of quiet purpose. The Whitaker Trust blossomed beyond anything she had imagined. Survivors from across the country came forward, some with broken marriages, others with financial ruin, and many with stories far darker than hers. Evelyn became a guiding light in their lives, not as a loud voice screaming for justice, but as a gentle presence who had walked through the fire and emerged with dignity intact. She built safe houses, launched financial literacy programs, and established legal aid branches in 3 cities. But in the stillness of her own home, Evelyn was not just a founder of a foundation, she was a woman relearning joy. She took painting classes on weekends, cooked her own meals with music echoing softly through the kitchen, and sat by her window each night to read, no longer needing to glance over her shoulder. She didn't follow the news anymore, not actively. She didn't need to, but the world had a way of whispering to her. At bookstores and cafes, in chance encounters, she heard her name spoken in admiration. People told her how her journey had changed them, how her silence had screamed louder than any campaign. She always accepted the words with gratitude, but never let them become her identity. Her revenge had been beautiful. Yes, but it was done. She had no interest in lingering in that battlefield. She had already buried it under blooming gardens of something new. And yet, not all ashes stayed buried. One afternoon, she received a letter, not by email or courier, but handwritten, delivered through her office's front desk in a plain, unmarked envelope. Inside was a single page. The handwriting was rough, desperate. It was from Celeste. She was in prison now, serving a 5-year sentence for financial fraud and conspiracy. The letter didn't plead for forgiveness, it was something stranger. Celeste wrote of how her relationship with Thomas had quickly turned toxic once Evelyn was out of the picture. He had been cruel, paranoid, even violent. She described nights locked in rooms, threats made over finances, and the crushing isolation that mirrored what Evelyn herself had endured. "I see now what he did to you," she wrote, "and I see what he turned me into. I don't expect you to care, but I had to say it. I'm sorry. Not for your forgiveness, just for my own peace." Evelyn sat with the letter for a long time, her fingers trembling slightly as she folded it back into its envelope. She didn't know how to feel. The fury that once burned so brightly in her chest had long since cooled, and in its place, there was something heavier, something close to pity. Thomas had destroyed more than just one life. He was a factory of ruin, churning people into shadows of themselves. That night, Evelyn stood on her balcony beneath a navy blue sky, stars blinking softly overhead. She thought of Celeste in her cell. She thought of herself in that mansion, all those years ago, watching her identity dissolve in the reflection of a gilded mirror. She thought of the version of herself who had once believed that love was meant to hurt a little, that sacrifice meant silence. And then she let it all go. She burned Celeste's letter in the fire pit on her terrace, watching the words curl and vanish into the breeze. She whispered, "Goodbye," not just to Celeste, but to the weight of everything. After that night, Evelyn's life began to feel lighter in ways she hadn't expected. Her laughter returned, not as a shield, but as a natural melody in her daily life. She adopted a golden retriever named Hugo who followed her everywhere, his tail always wagging, his eyes full of unconditional loyalty. She began hosting dinner parties, not the grand, curated affairs of her past, but intimate, candlelit evenings filled with stories, music, and real connection. She found herself surrounded by people who saw her not as a figure of tragedy or triumph, but simply as Evelyn. And that, she realized, was the greatest revenge of all: to live a life so full, so authentic, that the ghosts of the past no longer mattered. Still, fate had one more twist waiting. It came one spring morning, nearly 2 years after the downfall of Whitmore Industries. A headline popped up unexpectedly on her phone screen, catching her attention by sheer coincidence. Disgraced tycoon found dead in abandoned cabin. Her breath caught in her throat. She clicked. Thomas Whitmore, the article read, had been living in isolation in a remote cabin outside Elmsworth, evading creditors and pending charges. His body had been discovered by a hiker. Cause of death: suicide. He had left no note, just a bottle of bourbon, a stack of unpaid bills, and a once pristine photograph of himself and Evelyn, taken years ago at a charity ball, now water-stained and torn down the middle. Evelyn stared at the screen for a long time, numb. There was no triumph in this, no closure, just an echoing emptiness. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She simply turned off the phone, walked to her garden, and sat on the bench beneath the magnolia tree her mother had once loved. As the petals drifted around her like soft snow, she whispered to the wind, "I hope you find peace, Thomas, wherever you are." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't forgetting. It was acceptance. The weeks after Thomas's death were strangely quiet, almost too still, like the breath held just before dawn. The town of Elmsworth, which had once buzzed with gossip about Evelyn Whitmore's disappearance and return, offered only muted headlines. Now brief notices about the conclusion of the Whitmore estate, a closed investigation, a passing mention of a funeral that no one attended. Evelyn didn't go. She didn't need to. She had already said goodbye, not to the man in the casket, but to the part of herself that had once been shackled to his shadow. What remained now was hers alone, her story, her freedom, her quiet resilience. After Thomas was gone, the media, always hungry for a clean ending, tried to put a bow on her tale. Justice for the silent wife. A queen reclaims her crown. From scandal to saint. But Evelyn declined all interviews, rejected all book deals, and ignored every podcast invitation. She wasn't interested in being a symbol. She had done what she came to do. She had survived, reclaimed her name, dismantled the empire that fed on her silence, and planted seeds in its ashes that now bloomed in the hearts of countless others. That was enough. Still, in private moments, she sometimes walked the halls of memory. She thought of how it all began, of how a smile can lie, how love can rot from the inside, how power can disguise itself as devotion. And yet, even with all she'd endured, Evelyn never regretted her journey. If anything, she had come to see it as a crucible, a painful but necessary transformation. She hadn't just returned to herself, she had become someone stronger, wiser, and more fiercely alive. On the 1-year anniversary of the opening of the Whitaker Haven, her flagship shelter for women and children, Evelyn stood before a modest crowd gathered in the garden, surrounded by laughter, flowers, and survivors who had found safety in her vision. She wore a simple linen dress, her silver hair pinned back, and her eyes, those stormy eyes, now glistened with light instead of pain. She didn't prepare a speech. She simply stepped up and said, "I was once lost. I was once silent. But I am neither of those things now. And neither are you." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, it was soft, reverent, as if each clap was a heartbeat echoing in the soul of everyone present. Among the crowd was a young girl named Mira, just 16, who had been rescued from a violent household 6 months prior. She looked at Evelyn the way one might look at a lighthouse on a black sea. After the event, she approached slowly and asked, "How did you know when it was over? When the pain stopped?" Evelyn smiled, crouching down so their eyes met. "The pain never really stops," she said gently. "But one day, you realize it doesn't own you anymore. And that's the day it ends." Mira nodded, tears in her eyes, and hugged her. In that embrace, Evelyn felt the final stitch of healing pull through the fabric of her life. It wasn't revenge that completed her, it was that moment, that connection, that renewal of hope. That night, she sat on her terrace under the stars, Hugo's head resting on her lap, and thought about everything that had come before. And for the first time in years, she whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, just to the universe for carrying her through. Time, as always, moved on. Evelyn continued her work, but she also allowed herself new adventures. She traveled to Italy, where she spent a month painting the Amalfi Coast. In Kyoto, she walked beneath cherry blossoms and wrote poetry by hand. In Morocco, she bought spices and danced under desert stars. Her life became her own again. Every day a deliberate brushstroke on a canvas she no longer feared to paint. Back in Elmsworth, the mansion that once belonged to her and Thomas was finally sold to a nonprofit that transformed it into a museum of regional history and art. She visited only once, walking through the grand halls now stripped of ego and filled with culture. The ballroom where she'd once hosted fundraisers now displayed local artists' work. The library held archives, journals, and memoirs, including a small, anonymously donated folder titled Reconstruction, Notes on Surviving the Unsurvivable. She smiled at that, knowing it had found the right home. Evelyn's story eventually faded from headlines, not because it lost meaning, but because she had carefully ensured its legacy would live on in impact, not spectacle. When she turned 60, her friends threw her a quiet celebration. There were no photographers, no staged speeches, just candlelight, homemade food, and a backyard full of laughter. Mira, now in college, gave her a bracelet she'd made by hand, engraved with the words, "She turned ashes into gardens." Evelyn wore it every day afterward. It wasn't long before she met someone new, not in the way movies depict, not some dramatic whirlwind of romance, but a slow, warm companionship with a man named Samuel, a retired historian who volunteered at her foundation. He didn't try to fix her. He just walked beside her. And that, she found, was more than enough. Years later, when Evelyn wrote her first and only book, she didn't title it after her pain or her victory. She called it The Quiet Bloom. It was a collection of essays and reflections not about revenge, but about resilience. She wrote about gardens and silence, and the dignity of rising without the need to roar. The book was quietly powerful, much like the woman who had penned it. And in its final chapter, she wrote, "Revenge may taste sweet, but peace is what nourishes." I chose peace, not because he deserved it, but because I did. And with those final words, Evelyn's story came full circle, not as a tale of bitterness, but of reclamation. Her legacy wasn't the fall of a tyrant, it was the rise of a woman who refused to be forgotten.